Let's pick it up in Romans 11. It begins speaking about the remnant of Israel. So Paul says in verse 1, I ask then, did God reject his people? That's a rhetorical device, a rhetorical question. And he answers, by no means. And it's important not to miss that. If we do, we will buy into various facets of the replacement theology movements. So while many Jews have rejected Jesus as Messiah, the vast majority, certainly in the first century, God has not rejected them as his chosen people. In Isaiah 65:2, the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 2, we see God's continued effort to reach his chosen people regardless of their disobedience. As often said, Israel is the apple of God's eye. Paul continues, he says, I am myself an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. Again, he didn't reject his chosen people because his own nature is unchanging. His promises are therefore irrevocable because they are grounded in his immutability, the unchanging nature of God. So, just like we discovered in our last section, the promises made to Israel um, are grounded in his unchanging nature, like I just mentioned, which includes the fact that Israel, or the majority of the Israelites, would reject Jesus as the Messiah, was foreordained. It was clearly foreknown, since it would be grounded in his omniscience. And I think we need to reiterate those points over and over again. If not, we're going to come out with a mistaken hermeneutic or interpretation. So, continuing in verse 2, do you know what the scriptures says in the passage about Elijah? He's going back here to make a comparison. How he appealed to God against Israel. He says, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him, to Elijah? I remember Mount Carmel, if you've been to Israel, right up the road from the valley of Megiddo. Um, I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. That's what God says. So too at the present time, which would be in the mid-first century when Paul penned this letter, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace, not of works, by grace. If by grace, then it is no longer by works. Grace and works are precisely the opposite. You can't have both. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. So God showed grace to the 7,000 in the context of Elijah's day. The same is true of the first century and even to this day. There's always existed a faithful Jewish remnant, faithful in their messianic Judaism, meaning Jews who have accepted Jesus as their Messiah. This messianic body of believers is what I believe to be the elect, described in the next passage. What then? Another rhetorical question. What then? What Israel sought so earnestly, it did not obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened, as it is written. Quote, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so they could not see, and ears so that they could not hear, to this very day. To this very day refers to the spiritual dullness of the Jews rejecting Jesus as the Messiah by faith. The acceptance of faith um, works. The acceptance of faith works, but not by means of works. The law is what the Jews live and die by. The Orthodox Jew, the believing Jew, not the Messianic Jew. So if you were to tell a Jew, look, you just have to put your faith and trust in the Mashiach or Yeshua of Israel, that's a hard pill to swallow because it's such a work-oriented salvation, if you will. So there we have the dullness, spiritual dullness of the Jews who reject Jesus because of their own self-righteousness blinding them, if you will. In verse 9, Paul continues, referring to King David. He says, and David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. While the psalmist here is referring to the enemies of David, he's speaking of his own enemies of his day, Paul is using this as an analogy to demonstrate that the heart of unbelieving Israel has been divinely hardened by God, similar to the way the Pharaoh of Egypt hardened his own heart first, and in turn God hardened or crystallized the heart of Pharaoh even more, because God foreknew that there was no way that the Pharaoh was going to turn and repent, etc. And of course, in all that, God was glorified even more. Next, we read of engrafted branches, which are the Gentiles. So think of the olive tree. Olive tree represents Israel in this context. And so you have one branch coming out of it, which is the faithful Jewish remnant grounded in the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, the ancient Hebrew fathers that we read of in the Tanakh or the Old Testament. And then there's a wild branch, sort of like, been stuck in or grafted into this olive tree. That is Gentile Christians, non-Jews, everybody that's non-Jewish. So in verse 11, he asks again, did they, referring to the Jews, stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Are they beyond redemption? Are they beyond recovery? Is God done? Has he turned his back on Israel? Paul says, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. What's important about that is, had they not rejected the Messiah, or you can look at it this way, because they rejected the Messiah, the gospel and the good news of Jesus went to the Gentile believing world. But God foreknew that as well. So because of the Israelite transgression or rejecting Jesus as Messiah, salvation has gone to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. Now, if God was done with Israel, there would be no point to make her envious of Gentile believers. And I don't think at the present moment, I don't think that the Orthodox Jew is envious of the Christian for believing in an imposter, just, Jesus, because they don't believe he's the Messiah. They believe he's a false Messiah, etc. So they're not quite there yet. But in verse 12 we read, but if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? So there's going to be a greater fullness, obviously, to his chosen people. This language would be completely meaningless if God is done with Israel. So the rhetorical question, is God done with Israel? Paul answers, certainly not. They're not beyond recovery. He's not done with them. He has always worked with them, again, that remnant. And when much of Israel rejected the Messiah due to their self-righteousness, as I mentioned before, self-righteousness is blinding, just like legalism in Christian churches is binding and blinding. Salvation went to the Gentiles. And all of the talk of envy that all of Israel will be saved, which we'll be reading next, all Israel will be saved, has to be yet future. God can't be done with Israel. Again, that is all grounded in God's irrevocable promises and unchanging nature. Malachi 3:6, I, the Lord thy God, I do not change. Verse 13, I'm talking to you Gentiles, inasmuch, so now, of course, this was written to the church at Rome. Inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I make much of my ministry, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them, save some of the Jews. You can see there, if Paul has not given up on the salvation of the Israelites, nor should the Gentile, the church. We shouldn't give up on that either. Paul's choice of words is interesting when he says, and save some of them. It seems to demonstrate that he hopes that all will be saved, which he says later on, all Israel shall be saved. But what does that mean? 3 different views on that passage, and I'll give you all three, and you can make up your mind. Verse 15, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, that's a strong verse. We have here the reconciliation of the planet. If their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Strange language. We'll explain that in a second. Verse 16, if the part of the dough, now he's talking about, bread, almost think of unleavened bread, think of leavened bread, etc. So if part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches, or so are its branches from the olive tree. So just like the historical resurrection was the mark of Christian truth, right? In the same way, once Israel puts her faith in Yeshua, the vast majority of Israelites placing their faith in Jesus, the Messiah, this event will be as great as the final resurrection of all believers. I think that's a safe interpretation of that view. Verse 17, if some of the branches have been broken off, which refers to unbelieving Israel, but it's a temporary broken off. And you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share. Let me stop there. So the Gentile theology, I call it a Gentile view, a Gentile theology, is the idea that the church has replaced Israel. We are the spiritual Israel. We are the spiritual Jews. And all of the promises made in the Old Testament to the patriarchs are somehow now transferred unto the church. God is done with Israel. It's just left. She's just left to her own. Now, you might have a Jew here and there places their faith in Jesus. Great. Then they become part of the church, which is all one, and there's no distinction between ethnic Israel, etc. Having said that, when you look at this verse, in that some branches have been broken off, and you have a wild branch grafted into the olive tree, we ought to consider ourselves very blessed to be a wild olive Gentile nation with no rhyme or reason as far as Mosaic law is concerned, etc. We can't sit here and be puffed up and think, nor think that we are grafted in. Somehow that means we've replaced the whole olive tree. I just don't buy that at all. Again, though a wild olive shoot, in verse 17, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, we are not to boast over those branches. So we can't boast. We're no greater. There's no distinction at the foot of the cross. God is not partial. He makes no distinction between Jew and Gentile. That is not to say that ethnic Israel, for it to continue, is somehow favoritism with God. He had to choose one nation, and he chose Israel. Had he not chosen Israel, he would have to choose another. And it's interesting that he chose them, on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by all these nations that are hell-bent on destroying her. And it's always in the news. Whatever happens in Israel, they're talking about it on CNN and Fox, etc. So it seems that whatever occurs in Israel, it becomes world news immediately. Why is that? Because she's a stumbling block to the rest of the world. God is still working. So do not boast over those branches. If you do consider this, you should not, I should rephrase that, you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off, so I could be grafted in. Verse 20, he answers, granted. He's sort of raising the questions and he answers back and forth, almost like a debate. He says, granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief. And you, the Gentiles, stand by faith. And that's the part that kills them, because you can't just believe in faith. It's a works-oriented salvation for many, many Jews. Do not be arrogant, but be afraid. Why should we be afraid? For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Interesting. So you could think of the analogy I shared before. If God revoked the promises made to Israel, maybe he'll revoke his promise of salvation to the Gentile church as well. So obviously he's not going to do that. As we saw in Romans 8, we have the ordo salutis, the order of salvation, from the salvation moment, sanctification, and then up glorification. As far as replacement theology goes, the Gentile believer is the wild branch that's grafted into the olive tree. And the olive tree, we said, is symbolic for Israel. The branches that are temporarily broken off is Israel, right? Or are Israel. If replacement theology is true, it is difficult to reconcile the Gentile believer as a branch while at the same time maintaining that the olive tree, which is Israel, and her promises are somehow transferred to the church. The language of the Gentile branch, or the wild olive branch, being grafted into the tree makes little sense if the church already is the spiritual Israel. We'd replace the whole tree. So it simply does not work. Israel is not beyond hope. God is not done or through with her. Verse 22, he says, "Consider, therefore, the kindness and sternness of God, sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, the Gentile, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off." The Gentile, again, is not to be puffed up. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in also, for God is able to graft them in again. He's more than able to graft them in again, and he will. After all, if you were cut off or cut out of an olive tree that is wild by its nature and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? The olive tree, still Israel, will be grafted in again. So God is far from done. If not, these rhetorical devised questions do not make any sense at all. If you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, this is verse 24, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated Israelite olive tree, how much more readily will these Israelite branches be grafted into their olive tree, their own olive tree? They're not going to be grafted into a Gentile olive tree, or spiritual Israel as such. Next, we will pick it up in verse 25.